With the bonfire lit, the story begins. Friends. Deep in the legendary Catacombs of Paris, a system of tunnels filled with human bones has been hiding dark secrets for centuries. When a group of urban explorers find an old footage of a terrified man fleeing unknown corridors, curiosity leads them on a macabre journey. As they move beyond the mapped areas, they discover that something inhuman lurks in the darkness, something they do not want to be found. What began as an expedition to find out the truth soon becomes a desperate struggle for survival. After all, not everyone who enters can leave, and the cameras continue recording. The early morning silence was broken by the sound of keys being frantically typed. Lucas, an urban legend enthusiast and amateur explorer, was delving into the darkest corners of the internet when he found something disturbing. On an underground cataphile forum, an anonymous user had posted a link to an old video, supposedly recorded deep in the catacombs of Paris. The description promised something that had never been revealed to the public: the last transmission from a missing explorer. Lucas hesitated for a moment before clicking. The recording was grainy, with static and muffled noise, but what was seen was clear enough to give even the most skeptical viewer goosebumps. The camera shook, focusing on endless corridors of bones piled together in strange patterns. The man behind the lens was breathing heavily, muttering something inaudible. Suddenly, he swung the camera around, capturing a slender shadow moving in the dark depths, followed by a piercing scream. The filming ended abruptly, leaving Lucas with a chill down his spine. The next day, he gathered his friends: Sophie, a documentary filmmaker passionate about horror stories; Ethan, the group's skeptic, always ready to deny any legend; and Ben, an equipment technician with a morbid fascination with the unknown. Gathered in Lucas's small living room, they watched the video repeatedly, discussing its authenticity. Sophie argued that if it were real, it would be a historic discovery. Ethan, as expected, thought it was an elaborate production to scare tourists. Ben, however, seemed restless, his eyes glued to the screen. "If this is fake, then someone did a phenomenal job," muttered Ben. "But what if it's real?" The idea of exploring the catacombs didn't take long to be accepted. They knew that officially, only a small part of the catacombs was open to the public, but rumors of secret passages and hidden maps were rife on underground forums. Sophie revealed that she had managed to make contact with an ancient cataphile, someone who knew the undocumented passages and could guide them to the forbidden tunnels. The group's excitement was evident, but Lucas couldn't get the man's expression of pure terror out of his head in the video. The night before the expedition, Lucas received an anonymous message on his phone. "Don't go beyond the red line. They're down there waiting." He showed the message to the group, but Ethan just laughed, suggesting it was a joke from one of the cataphiles. However, a seed of doubt was planted in their minds. The next day, with backpacks full of equipment, powerful flashlights, night vision cameras, and extra batteries, they headed to the discreet entrance to the catacombs, located in an abandoned area of the city. The rusty iron gate creaked as it was forced aside, revealing a spiral staircase that descended into the unknown. Lucas took a deep breath, taking one last look at the surface before disappearing into the shadows. They didn't know it yet, but this would be the last time they would see the light of day. The descent down the stone stairs was slow and claustrophobic. The air was heavy and carried a damp, slightly metallic odor. Each step echoed disturbingly, as if the darkness itself was listening. Sophie recorded everything with her handheld camera, documenting every detail with nervous excitement. "We're officially entering forbidden territory," he whispered, his voice reverberating off the walls. After endless minutes, they arrived at a narrow corridor where the walls were decorated with human bones arranged in intricate patterns. Lucas felt a shiver run up his spine. It was different from seeing photos on the internet. Being there, surrounded by centuries of death, was almost suffocating. Ethan, trying to ease the tension, laughed nervously. "Just bones, no ghosts, right?" Ben consulted the printed map they had acquired at the underground forum, marking the indicated passages with a flashlight. "Here," he said, pointing to a barely visible entrance to the left. "If we follow this path, we go beyond the tourist area. This is where the real challenge begins." They advanced in single file, feeling the uneven ground beneath their feet and the absolute silence swallowing their voices. The deeper they went, the more they noticed the difference. The walls grew tighter, the tunnels seemed to shrink around them, and a growing cold set in, making every breath visible in the frigid air. After an hour of exploring narrow corridors and empty rooms, they found a larger chamber with strange markings carved into the stone. Rudimentary symbols, some resembling human figures, others something they couldn't decipher. Sophie knelt, playing the recordings with trembling fingers. "This isn't in the historical records. This is much older than anything I've ever seen." Lucas looked at the symbols with a mix of fascination and terror. He had the uneasy feeling that they were being watched. Ethan scoffed. "Probably some urban artist trying to scare the likes of us." It was then that they heard it. A distant sound, something scratching the walls ahead. Everyone froze. Ben shone the flashlight, but the darkness seemed to devour it. "It must just be an animal," muttered Lucas, more to convince himself than anything else. Sophie, still with the camera on, looked at them. "Shall we continue?" They didn't know, but that sound was just the first warning. The group advanced through the tight tunnels, guided by the dim lighting of their flashlights. The air grew heavier and heavier, carrying a smell of damp mixed with something else. Something rancid, like rotting meat. Lucas tried to ignore the feeling that they were being swallowed by the earth, but his heart was hammering in his chest. "Think about the incredible content this will generate," Sophie said, trying to break the suffocating silence as she recorded. Minutes later, Ben stopped abruptly. "That's not on the map," he said, frowning as he examined the crumpled paper in the flashlight. Before them, a corridor descended even deeper into what seemed to be a bottomless pit of darkness. The walls were covered in writing in a language none of them recognized. Some marks appeared to have been made with fingernails, while others resembled repetitive patterns that almost pulsed under the light. "Doesn't sound like a good idea," Ethan muttered, wiping his sweaty forehead. "If we stray too far, we could get really lost." Lucas hesitated, looking at Sophie, who was already pointing her camera at the shadowy hallway. "We came this far," she said with a tight smile. "We need to see what's down there." They followed, going down a narrower tunnel, where they had to duck to proceed. The silence was absolute except for the muffled sound of their footsteps and breathing. But then, another noise came, a low sound like something being dragged, echoing in the distance. They stopped immediately, exchanging apprehensive glances. "That's not an echo," Ben whispered, swallowing hard. Lucas took a deep breath and walked a little further, his flashlight flickering. It was then that he saw something on the ground, an old explorer's helmet broken in half, with deep marks that looked like claws. He crouched down, examining it carefully. This must be from someone who disappeared years ago," he murmured, his voice shaking. Suddenly, Ben's walkie-talkie emitted static. Everyone froze. The voice that came from the radio was distorted, guttural, and said just one word repeatedly. "Back." Ethan turned with a start, shining his flashlight down the hallway. Nothing, just impenetrable darkness. But the feeling of being watched was almost tangible now. "This is a joke, right? Someone's playing a trick on us," he said, his voice cracking. Lucas didn't respond. He only felt an icy chill when he noticed something he hadn't noticed before. Footprints. Lots of footprints, and none of them were theirs. The silence in the tunnels now seemed more oppressive than ever. The group continued to move forward with cautious steps, trying to ignore the lingering feeling that they were not alone. Sophie continued recording, her fingers shaking slightly, over the camera. "This is pure gold," she whispered, trying to mask the growing fear in her voice. Suddenly, Ben's flashlight flickered and went out for a few seconds before coming back to life. "Shit, the batteries were charged," he muttered, tapping the equipment. Lucas looked at him with a worried expression. remembering the reports on forums that mentioned unexplained failures in electrical equipment in certain parts of the catacombs. Few meters ahead, the tunnel opened into a larger room, filled with rows and rows of bones carefully stacked, forming sinister arches. In the center of the room, there was something different. An old handheld camera, covered in dust and moss, lay on the floor, as if it had been left in a hurry. Sophie approached slowly, picking up the object with a mix of curiosity and apprehension. "We found something." Ben quickly connected the camera to his makeshift laptop and pulled up the contents. There was only a single video. They gathered around the screen as the file began to play. The image was unstable and showed someone running desperately through corridors identical to the ones they were in now. The cameraman's labored breathing echoed, while muffled screams could be heard in the background. Suddenly, the camera captured something. A tall, thin figure, moving inhumanly through the darkness with eyes that reflected the light like a predator's. The video ended abruptly with a thud and the sound of something scratching the lens before everything went out. This is real," Ethan murmured, unable to hide the tremor in his voice. Lucas looked around, his heart racing. "We need to get out of here now!" But before they could move, a sound echoed through the tunnel. Something was scratching at the stone nearby, and slow, shuffling footsteps could be heard, getting closer and closer. Ben quickly shut down the laptop and pointed his flashlight in the direction of the sound, but nothing appeared. Just the pulsing darkness of the endless corridors. "We heard that, right? It wasn't all in our heads?" Sophie whispered, taking a few steps back. Lucas looked at the ground and noticed something even more terrifying. Fresh scratch marks on the stones, as if something had been crawling along the walls moments before they got there. And then, a whispered voice, low and distorted, came from the tunnel behind them. "Run!" Sophie's screams echoed through the tunnel as the group bolted in the opposite direction to the frightening sound. Lanterns flickered, casting distorted shadows on the bone-strewn stone walls. The air seemed to get thicker, making it difficult for Lucas, who was leading the escape, to breathe. "This way!" he shouted, turning quickly into a narrow hallway. After running aimlessly for minutes that seemed like an eternity, they arrived at a vast underground chamber. The place was colossal. A real city made of bones. Skulls and femurs formed elaborate arches. Macabre columns supported the vaulted ceiling, and a massive altar-like structure dominated the center of the room. The silence was almost deafening, as if time itself had stopped there. "My God," Sophie whispered, pointing the camera at the magnitude of the scene before them. That was never documented." Ethan, struggling to catch his breath, approached the bone carvings, noticing strange patterns carved into them. "This isn't just art. There's something ritualistic here." Lucas bent down near the altar and found something that made him catch his breath. Unlit candles, still with traces of recent wax, and symbols painted with a dark substance. "This isn't just ancient history. Someone was here recently." Before they could process their find, a metallic sound echoed through the chamber. They quickly spun around and saw at the entrance to the hall a motionless figure watching them. At first, it looked like just a shadow cast by the flashlights, but as the light flickered, it was revealed to be something much worse. The figure was tall and disproportionately thin, with glowing eyes that seemed to pierce the darkness. His skin was a sickly gray, and his limbs seemed to be twisted at the wrong angles. Lucas held the flashlight with shaking hands and tried to speak, but no sound came out of his mouth. It was then that the creature moved, too fast for something so skeletal. In the blink of an eye, he disappeared into the darkness of the nearest tunnel, leaving behind only the sound of his wet, ragged breathing echoing off the stone walls. "That wasn't humane," whispered Ben, taking a hesitant step back. Sophie held the camera tightly, her voice shaking. "This was waiting for us." The tension was unbearable, but the fear of returning through the same corridors they came from was even greater. Lucas knew they needed to move forward, hoping to find a way out, or at least a safe place to regroup. The problem was there a way out? The silence that followed the creature's appearance was suffocating. The group remained motionless, only listening to their own heavy breathing and accelerated heartbeats. Lucas was the first to react, swallowing hard and pointing to a narrow tunnel on the other side of the bone chamber. "We have to continue. Staying here is not an option." Ben hesitated, looking back. "What if that thing is still around?" "She is," Sophie replied, holding the camera with shaking hands. "And he's watching us." They continued forward, careful footsteps echoing through the tunnel that seemed to narrow with every meter they traveled. The walls were covered in scratches, and strange symbols unlike those they had seen before. They were recent brands. The feeling of being watched grew every moment. Suddenly, Ethan's flashlight began to fail. "Oh no, not now," he grumbled, tapping the equipment. The light blinked intermittently, revealing quick flashes of something ahead. Then, before he could react, Ethan let out a choked scream. Darkness swallowed him. "Ethan!" Lucas shouted, running to where his friend was a second before. Ben's flashlight illuminated the empty floor, revealing only Ethan's fallen backpack, his things scattered across the floor. There was no sign of him, no footprints, nothing. He just disappeared. Panic took over the group. Sophie began to hyperventilate, tears streaming down her face. "This isn't happening. He was right here." Ben started walking backwards, trying to maintain control. "There has to be a passage, something. He can't have disappeared like that." Lucas held Sophie's shoulders, trying to calm her. "We will not be separated. No matter what happens, we will stay together." A low, distorted laugh echoed through the surrounding tunnels. It wasn't Ethan's voice. It was something much more wrong. "We need to get out of here now," Ben said, pulling Lucas. They ran blindly through the tunnels, aimlessly, with the feeling that the darkness was swallowing them more and more. Then Sophie stopped abruptly, shaking, pointing her camera at a wall. On the small monitor, through the night vision lens, they could see something impossible. Ethan's silhouette, standing further down the tunnel, his eyes completely black, motionless. Just watching. Lucas swallowed. "That's not Ethan," Sophie sobbed, moving the camera away from her face. When they looked again, he was no longer there. The group stood still for a moment, unable to process what they had just seen. The image of Ethan, or what appeared to be him, still lingered in their minds like a silent threat. Sophie was shaking, hugging the camera to her chest. "We have to get out of here," she whispered, her voice breaking. Lucas nodded, trying to remain calm. "Let's continue." In silence, they followed a side corridor, cramped and full of inscriptions carved into the walls. Unlike the previous tunnels, these marks seemed older, much deeper and more detailed. Some symbols were familiar, reminiscent of forgotten cults, while others seemed to be warnings. Ben ran his hand over one of them, his expression intrigued and scared at the same time. "I've seen this before. On forums. That symbol means barrier. Like someone is trying to contain something in here." Lucas approached, feeling his pulse racing. "Or stop something from getting out," he muttered. Further along, they found an old leather book, lying on a pile of bones. The pages were fragile, but some words were still legible. Sophie illuminated the pages, reading in a low voice. "They must not be disturbed. Their eyes see in the dark. Their voices imitate the lost. If they hear their name, run." Sophie closed the book with a snap, terror written all over her face. "This is serious. It's not just a myth. They're here." "Who are they?" Ben asked, his voice shaking. Before they could respond, the sound of distant footsteps echoed through the halls, coming from all directions. The group froze, eyes wide. "It's not possible," Lucas whispered. "There can't be anyone else here." Sophie's flashlight blinked for a second, and in the fraction of time, the light failed. Everyone saw. At the end of the corridor, several motionless figures stood, their faces obscured by shadows. They didn't move. They just stood there, watching. Lucas swallowed hard, feeling panic take over his body. "Run! Now!" They dashed down the tunnel, trying desperately to leave the figures behind. The walls seemed to tighten around them, as if the place itself were alive. The sound of heavy breathing echoed, but they couldn't tell if it was theirs or something chasing them. Then Sophie tripped and fell, her camera sliding across the floor. Lucas stopped to help her, but before he could pull her up, an icy whisper blew into his ear. "Lucas." He turned sharply, but there was no one there, just darkness. Ben pulled, the two of them, and they continued running until they found a small chamber. They closed themselves inside her, panting and terrified. Sophie took the camera with trembling hands, and when reviewing the recorded images, she noticed something terrifying. When the flashlight blinked, there were not only human figures. Something much larger was among them. Something that shouldn't exist. The silence inside the chamber was overwhelming. The only audible sound was the group's rapid breathing and the faint whirring of Sophie's camera, which was still recording each terrifying moment. Ben pressed his ear against the damp wall, trying to pick up any sounds coming from the hallways. "Nothing," he whispered, but his face didn't reflect relief. Lucas sat on the floor, rubbing his shaking hands against his face. "That doesn't make sense. I saw people back there, but they weren't moving. They were just watching us." Sophie kept her eyes glued to the camera screen, rewinding the recording. "It wasn't just people," she said, her voice barely coming out. "Look." They gathered around the small screen, watching the part where the flashlight flickered. Initially, the figures seemed static, just humanoid silhouettes, but as Sophie adjusted the contrast, something more revealed itself. Behind them, deep in the shadows, a colossal creature crept silently along the walls. Its limbs were abnormally long and pale eyes glowed in the dark. Ben took a step back, pale. That was too close. A sudden sound echoed through the tunnel, a slow, methodical shuffling. Everyone turned at once, their flashlights shaking. The sound grew closer, as if something was sliding along the walls, moving with cruel patience. Lucas swallowed. "Be silent," he whispered. For a moment it seemed like the noise had stopped, but then something even worse came. A whisper, creeping through the darkness. Low, hoarse, and unmistakable. "Sophie." She stifled a scream, covering her mouth with her hands. Ben grabbed his arm and Lucas signaled them to follow the side tunnel. "Let's get out of here," he whispered, guiding them down a narrow passage that curved in unpredictable directions. As they advanced, the sounds behind them became more insistent. The shuffling turned into rhythmic banging on the walls, echoing as if something was surrounding them. Sophie stumbled and almost fell, but Ben caught her. I heard my voice," she whispered, terrified. "I heard my own voice coming from the darkness." Lucas felt a shiver run up his spine. They imitate the lost. When they reached a fork in the road, they noticed a strange inscription on the ground. Unlike the others, this one seemed recent, marked by human hands. It was an arrow pointing to the left with a single word written in French. "Hope. Hope." Sophie hesitated. "What if it's a trap? Or our only chance?" Lucas replied, his voice firm, and they headed left. As they walked away, they heard a terrible sound coming from the tunnel they were leaving behind. A thin laugh, which seemed to emanate from all sides at the same time. Something was reveling in their fear, and they knew they hadn't seen the worst yet. The corridor seemed to stretch infinitely before them, the footsteps echoing strangely, as if they were followed by invisible shadows. The flashlights flickered intermittently, and each time darkness took over for a brief second, Lucas felt his heart stop, expecting to see something horrible when the light returned. Sophie clutched the camera to her chest, her wide eyes scanning the walls covered in disturbing inscriptions. Some showed human figures kneeling before impossible creatures, others depicted sinister rituals, and all conveyed the same harrowing message: they were never alone here. It was Ben who found the door, an ancient, corroded iron entrance, half open, hidden by a pile of bones. With effort, he pushed the remains aside and the door creaked in protest, revealing a small room dimly lit by still-lit candles. "This isn't abandoned," Lucas muttered, scanning the room. In the center of the room, a stone table was covered in notes in Old French, along with tape recordings, detailed maps of the catacombs, and disturbing photographs of people, past explorers. Many of the faces in the photos were crossed out, but one image in particular made Sophie gasp. It was a photo of the lost explorer from the video they found earlier, his pale face and empty eyes staring straight into the camera. But someone had written a word in shaky letters on his forehead: condemned. Ben was frantically going through the papers. These are records, people who came before us. And look at this. He picked up a dusty journal and read it aloud. They watch us, they copy our faces, they hear our thoughts. If you get in, you'll never get out. Lucas turned towards the exit, the feeling of claustrophobia tightening his chest. We're fucked, he muttered. Sophie continued exploring the place and found one of the recording tapes in an old cassette player that was still functional. With trembling fingers, he pressed the play button. A hoarse and desperate voice filled the room. They take our voices. They pretend to be us. Never trust what you hear. Ever. Suddenly, the recording was interrupted by distorted laughter. The candles flickered violently, as if a draft of cold air had swept through the room. Then, outside, something scraped the iron door, slowly and methodically. The sound was unmistakable. Nails against metal. Lucas quickly turned off his flashlight, gesturing for everyone to be silent. The group remained motionless, listening to the ragged breathing of Sophie and Ben next to them. The scratching stopped, but was replaced by something much worse. A voice coming from the hallway. Era Ethan. Lucas, Sophie, where are you? I'm lost. Ben covered his mouth with his hand, suppressing a sob of fear. Lucas squeezed his eyes shut, fighting the urge to respond. He knew the truth. Ethan was dead, or worse. Sophie whimpered softly, tears streaming down her face. Ethan's voice from outside repeated, more insistent, almost offended. Lucas, why are you ignoring me? Lucas held Sophie tightly, feeling her tremble in his arms as Ethan's voice continued to call out to them in the hallway. But there was something wrong. The intonation didn't seem right. It was almost as if someone was trying to imitate Ethan but failing on the details. Ben clutched the flashlight to his chest, sweat dripping down his forehead. He can't be alive, he whispered, panic evident in his voice. We saw him disappear. The voice from the hallway became more insistent. Lucas, Sophie, I need you. Lucas took a deep breath, fighting the urge to run. He motioned for everyone to move slowly away from the door and then whispered, Don't answer. Don't make any noise. Sophie held the camera with a shaking hand, pointing at the entrance. Suddenly, something pushed the door violently, making it creak. The sound of metal reverberated through the small room, and a tense silence followed. Then, little by little, the doorknob began to turn on its own. Lucas looked at Ben, terror in both their eyes. Run, he said in a low voice. They exited through the other side of the room, entering an even narrower and darker tunnel. The path seemed endless, and every time they looked back, they saw the darkness closing in behind them, as if the tunnels were alive, moving to keep them inside. Sophie's breathing became labored, and she muttered in despair. These tunnels, they don't make sense, they're changing. Ben looked at the map, his hands shaking. This wasn't here before, he said, pointing to a fork that wasn't in the records. These tunnels are transforming. Lucas forced himself to remain calm. We can't stop. We just need to move forward. We can find a way out. But then, the tunnels began to split in impossible directions, as if they had been designed to disorient them. They turned left, where there had previously been no turn. They led to dead ends, where seconds ago there had been a passage. Each corridor they chose seemed to take them back to the same point. Ethan's voice echoed again, more distant but still present. Lucas, why do you keep running away? Ben grabbed Lucas's arm. He's everywhere. How is he everywhere? With each corridor, the temperature seemed to drop further, and the smell of rot intensified. They began to hear whispers coming from the walls, voices of different people, all calling their names in increasingly familiar tones. Lucas closed his eyes for a moment, trying to think. We can't trust what we're seeing or hearing. It was then that Sophie pointed to a strange mark on the floor. It was an arrow carved into the stone, similar to the one they had found before. But instead of hope, this one said a different word in French. The trap. Lucas felt a shiver run down his spine. They're guiding us somewhere. And the worst part was that maybe they were already exactly where they wanted. The group stopped for a moment, staring at the inscription engraved on the ground. The trap. The words weighed on their minds like a death sentence. Sophie was gripping the camera so tightly her knuckles were white. Lucas, we're heading straight to where they want. I know, Lucas murmured, trying to hide the terror in his voice. But we have no choice. Standing still is not an option. Ben glanced at the surrounding tunnels, the flickering light of the flashlight barely piercing the darkness. Then let's choose the wrong path, he suggested. If they want us to go one way, we'll go the other way. Lucas nodded, and without saying anything else, they decided to follow the corridor opposite the arrow. The tunnels became even narrower, and the feeling of claustrophobia was suffocating. The floor was slippery, covered in a viscous liquid that gave off a smell of rot and iron. Then came the sound. First, it was a soft rustling sound, as if something huge was slowly creeping through the halls. Then a deep gurgling breath, something wet and sick. Sophie's camera caught something before they could see it with their own eyes. A monstrous shadow moving across the tunnel ceiling behind them. Long skeletal arms reached out, claws scraping against the stone. The eyes glowed a dead white, fixed on the group with predatory desire. "Run!" Lucas shouted, pulling Sophie by the arm. They dashed down the tunnel, the sound of the creature crawling just behind them, scraping the walls with a frantic pace. The thing didn't run. It moved, twisting its body in impossible ways as if its bones weren't real. Ben stumbled, his flashlight falling to the ground and spinning until it illuminated the creature fully. It was at that moment that Lucas and Sophie saw her in all her monstrosity. The thin, grayish skin hung from the bones. The hollow eyes were fixed as if the thing was savoring the moment. But the worst part was the mouth, a vertical slit that opened unnaturally, exposing rows of broken, uneven teeth. "Ben, get up!" Lucas shouted, pulling him away before it was too late. They ran through another tunnel, feeling the creature getting closer and closer. Then, without warning, the tunnels changed again. The path ahead that had previously seemed continuous now ended in a solid wall of bones. No, Sophie whimpered, punching the wall. Lucas glanced back at the creature, stopping at the entrance to the hallway, cocking its head to the side as if studying its prey. It was then that the thing spoke, with a grotesque smile. He opened his mouth and, in a perfect tone, with Ethan's voice, he said, "Where do you think you're going?" The sound of Ethan's voice coming out of that thing made the group's fear reach an unbearable level. Sophie sobbed, softly, backing against the wall of bones, while Lucas frantically tried to find another way out. Ben trembled, staring at the creature with wide eyes as if his mind was about to give way. "This isn't real. This can't be real," Ben muttered, squeezing his eyes shut, as if he could shake off the terrible sight. The creature tilted its head, watching them with a smile that widened unnaturally. His mouth opened a little wider, and now, in addition to Ethan's voice, whispers emerged from his gut. Voices of children, elderly people, and themselves. "Lucas, Sophie, Ben, we are you." Lucas didn't waste any more time. He grabbed Sophie by the arm and shouted to Ben, "Over here!" He threw himself against a narrow side opening in the wall of bones, forcing his way between the interlocking skulls and femurs. Sophie followed close behind, tears streaming down her dirty face. Ben hesitated for a second, fascinated and transfixed by the creature's gaze. "Ben, now!" Lucas shouted, pulling him by the collar of his jacket. The tunnel they entered was even tighter, and the air smelled of mold and decaying flesh. The lanterns flickered, creating shadows that moved as if they had a life of their own. The noise of the creature crawling through the bones behind them was constant, relentless. "We can't go on like this," Sophie panted, struggling to keep up. "We're trapped down here." Lucas knew she was right. Each corridor seemed to lead to another dead end, as if the catacombs themselves were conspiring against them. But then, he saw something up ahead, a faint flickering light. There! They ran towards the light, tripping and falling into a large circular room. In the center, there was a rusty metal structure, something that looked like an old ventilation shaft, perhaps an exit to the surface. But they were not alone. In the shadows of the room, pale, contorted figures crouched, like abandoned corpses that had suddenly decided to move. Their eyes reflected the dim light, and slowly they began to crawl towards the group. Sophie let out a choked scream, but Lucas didn't hesitate. "Help me up!" He pushed Sophie towards the metal structure, trying to open the rusty grill. Ben looked back and saw the original creature crawling into the room, its grotesque mouth opening in an expression of pure delight. "Stay with us." Lucas finally opened the grate and pushed Sophie into the duct. Go up." Ben tried to climb, but his hand slipped in the sweat and dried blood that covered his fingers. "Help me," he screamed, his eyes filled with despair. Lucas looked at the creatures that were slowly approaching. He knew they only had seconds. Ben continued to try to climb up the rusty duct, but his hand slipped, leaving behind red marks on the metal surface. Sophie was already inside, pulling herself up with difficulty, while Lucas frantically pushed Ben. But he was panicked, his wide eyes fixed on the approaching creatures. "I am unable," Ben shouted, his voice thick with desperation. "Ben, come up, fuck!" Lucas growled, trying to grab his backpack and pull him, but fear had taken over. The contorted figures began to advance faster, their joints creaking with each movement. The smell of rotting flesh filled the air. The original creature, the tallest and most grotesque, raised one of its cadaverous hands and pointed at Ben. His mouth opened again, and in a perfect tone, with Sophie's exact voice, he said, "Lucas, leave him behind." Lucas froze. He looked at Sophie in the duct, his eyes wide, muttering, "No, I would never say that." Panic took over Ben. "Lucas, don't leave me, please." Time seemed to drag by. Survival instinct fought against loyalty. Sophie looked down, crying, unable to help. The creatures were almost on top of them. Lucas made a brutal decision. He held Ben with all his strength and made one last effort, pushing him so hard that his friend managed to reach the edge. But at that exact moment, something pulled Lucas's leg. A scream of pain echoed through the room as sharp claws dug into his calf. The creature laughed at Ethan's voice. "There's always one left." Lucas kicked desperately, feeling his flesh tear. Ben pulled his arm with all his might, and by a miracle, Lucas was hoisted into the duct, feeling the creature's icy breath touching the back of his neck. The duct shuddered as the thing reached for them, its long fingers scratching the metal. But the tunnel was too narrow for her. "Hurry up!" Sophie screamed, crawling forward. They advanced through the cramped space, the sound of the enraged creatures echoing behind them. The duct seemed endless, each breath a painful effort. The blood from Lucas's leg left a trail wherever they went, but he ignored the pain. "I shouldn't have come," Ben muttered, panting. I knew this was going to go wrong." "Now is not the time for that," Lucas grumbled, pushing himself forward. Finally, a clarity appeared ahead, a small ventilation grill. Sophie kicked her hard, and she fell with a thud. One by one, they walked out into another stone corridor, but this one seemed different, older, more ritualistic. Sophie looked around, eyes wide. "Lucas, I don't think we're on the same level as the catacombs anymore." Ben groaned, desperate. "So, are we deeper?" Lucas looked at the dark tunnel ahead. A horrible feeling that they had fallen into an even bigger trap came over him. And worst of all, a shadow watched them at the end of the corridor. The shadow at the end of the corridor seemed to move imperceptibly, as if the darkness itself was breathing. Lucas, his heart racing, raised the flashlight, but the light barely penetrated the oppressive gloom. Ben staggered back, his breathing ragged. This isn't real. This can't be real." Sophie, still holding the camera, muttered, "We went somewhere we shouldn't have." His voice was just a thread of sound, and the camera shook in his hands. Lucas approached cautiously, pulling Sophie by the arm. "We have no other option. We have to move forward." As they walked down the narrow corridor, they noticed something strange. The walls were not made of ordinary stone. They seemed to pulse as if they were alive, covered in a thin veil of slimy moss that gave off an acrid smell. Primitive engravings spread across the path, representing humanoid figures kneeling before a colossal entity, whose body seemed to merge with the bowels of the underground. "I don't like this," Ben whispered, looking at the drawings. Suddenly, Sophie stopped, her eyes widening as she focused the camera on one of the most recent entries. "No, it can't be." Lucas approached and saw what she had found. In the midst of the ancient symbols was a single word written in modern French: "Ils ne sont pas morts." They're not dead. The warning sent a chill down Lucas's spine. Ben pushed away from the wall quickly, muttering, "We need to get out of here. Now!" Before they could react, a throaty laugh echoed through the hall. It wasn't loud, but it seemed to come from all sides at once. The walls vibrated slightly, and then something began to move in the darkness. The figure in front finally revealed itself. He was a man, or something that had once been human. His face was partially decayed, his skin hung in tatters, and his eyes were white as if his entire soul had been sucked out. He wore the tattered clothes of an explorer, and on his chest, a nameplate hung by a thread. Sophie leaned over to get a better look, and as she illuminated the name engraved on the plaque, she felt her heart stop. It was the name of the lost explorer from the original video. The being slowly raised its head, its chapped lips opening into a distorted smile. "You came too late," he whispered, his voice sounding like hundreds of voices in unison. Lucas pulled Sophie back, but the man stepped forward, his movements stiff and erratic. And then, behind him, the shadows began to move. Dozens of pale figures emerging from the tunnels, their skeletal bodies filling the corridor. Ben fell to his knees, desperation evident. "We're never going to leave here, are we?" Lucas held his shoulder tightly. "I won't let that happen." He looked around, looking for a way out. There has to be a way out. The dead explorer took another step forward, and the voices around him whispered in unison, "There is no way out." And then the flashlights flickered and went out. Darkness enveloped them completely, and with it came the whispers, voices familiar and distant, calling to them, pleading, threatening. Lucas held tightly to Sophie's hand, which was shaking uncontrollably, while Ben tried to turn the flashlight back on with trembling fingers. "Stay together," Lucas ordered, his voice firm despite his growing fear. Suddenly, something brushed Lucas's leg, something cold and sticky. He swallowed hard and pulled Sophie up, trying to ignore the feeling of something sliding across his skin. A soft moan echoed through the tunnel, and he felt the warm breath of an invisible presence at his side. Ben's flashlight blinked violently, and for a second, the light revealed the horror around them. The pale, twisted figures stood too close, their faces expressionless, their eyes empty, and their mouths sewn shut with dark thread. They didn't walk, they glided silently, approaching like living shadows. "Run!" Lucas shouted, pulling Sophie, and Ben forward, running blindly down the tunnel. The creatures followed, their footsteps echoing like an invisible army. The path seemed endless, and the tunnels seemed to change at every turn, becoming narrower and narrower. The cold stone floor gave way to something softer, more organic. Ben tripped and fell, screaming in pain. "I hurt my knee, I can't." Lucas looked back and saw the shadows moving closer and closer. They were trapped. That's when Sophie had an idea. "The cameras! Infrared light can help." She quickly connected the camera, the night vision illuminating the room in greenish tones. Lucas took the equipment and pointed it towards the front of the tunnel. The image revealed a side path, almost imperceptible to the naked eye. There, they crept through the tight passage, the sound of the creatures shuffling behind them growing louder. Lucas, already panting, pulled a backpack from his back and reached inside, feeling around until he found what he needed: a small load of improvised explosives that they had brought to open blocked passages. "Let's get this shit over with," he said, affixing the explosive to the tunnel entrance. Sophie and Ben were already on the other side when Lucas lit the makeshift fuse and ran as fast as he could. A violent crash reverberated through the tunnel, and a shower of rocks and dust covered them. The tunnel entrance collapsed behind them, drowning out the creature's sounds. The three fell to the ground, panting, covered in dust and blood. For a moment, only silence reigned. Lucas laughed, a nervous, incredulous laugh. "Did we do it?" But then from the end of the corridor where they had just escaped, a familiar voice sounded. "Lucas, do you think this can stop me?" It was Ethan's voice, and they realized that the real threat was still with them. Ethan's voice echoed through the narrow hallway, icy and implacable. Lucas swallowed hard, staring at Sophie and Ben, who were in shock. The cave-in behind them should have buried anything alive, but Ethan, or whatever that was still there. Ben stood up, staggering, his eyes full of despair. This can't be happening. We left him behind." Sophie clutched the camera to her chest, the infrared light revealing moving shadows on the walls. "He's everywhere. He's not Ethan anymore." Lucas took a deep breath, trying to think. "We have two options," he said, looking at the path ahead. "We can move forward and try to find a way out, or go back and face that." Ben laughed hysterically, shaking his head. "Are you crazy? Go back? We can't fight something we don't even know what it is." Lucas looked at Sophie, who just nodded, her eyes full of tears. "I just want to get out of here." That's when Ethan's voice sounded again, closer this time, as if he were whispering right next to them. "There's no way out, Lucas. There never was." Lucas closed his eyes for a moment. He knew that Ethan, or the thing that passed for him, was toying with them, using the labyrinth of the catacombs to disorient and test them. There was no easy choice, but there was a decision to be made. He stared at Ben. "You want to run away? Then go, but I'm going to find out what's going on here." Ben hesitated, looking at the dark tunnel in front of him. "Lucas, this is suicide." "Staying here is suicide," Lucas replied, determined. "We need to understand what we are up against." Sophie looked at the two of them, her eyes full of conflict. "We can't be separated." Ben took a deep breath, looking at the tunnel they came from and at Lucas, who was preparing to move towards the unknown. Finally, he shook his head. "You guys are crazy, but I'm not going alone." Lucas nodded. "Then let's go." They advanced through the tunnel, leaving behind the promise of an easy but uncertain escape. Each step was accompanied by whispers that seemed to emerge from the walls, calling their names, imitating their voices. Ethan, or whatever had replaced him, was waiting, and Lucas knew that soon they would have to face the truth. Or die trying. The tunnels seemed to close around them, as if the very structure of the catacombs were alive, pulsing, breathing. The air was heavier, filled with a rancid smell that stuck in your throat. Lucas led the way, his hands gripping the flashlight tightly, while Sophie and Ben followed closely behind, each with their own fears written on their faces. "We don't have much time," Sophie whispered, looking behind her, where the shadows seemed to move on their own. It was then that a figure appeared out of nowhere, blocking the path ahead. It was Ethan, or at least, what was left of it. His face was pale and twisted in a sickly smile, his eyes empty like two lifeless sockets. His mouth moved, but it wasn't his voice that came out. It was Lucas's voice. "Lucas, you've always been the strongest, but are you strong enough to leave someone behind?" Ben took a step back, mumbling something inaudible. Sophie held Lucas's arm, shaking. "That's not him," she whispered desperately. Lucas looked at Ethan, trying to remain calm. "You're not real," he said firmly. The creature tilted its head, a sinister smile growing on its chapped lips. "It doesn't matter if I'm real. What matters is that I'm here, and someone isn't leaving." Suddenly, Ethan, or the thing wearing his face, swooped forward, grabbing Ben by the shoulders and pulling him into the darkness. Ben screamed, struggling, his eyes wide with pure terror. "Lucas, help me!" Lucas lunged forward, grabbing Ben and pulling him with all his might. Sophie desperately hit the creature's arm with the flashlight, but the impact seemed to have no effect. The monster pulled, Ben with superhuman strength. "Don't let me," Ben begged, tears streaming down his dirty face. Lucas looked into his eyes, feeling the weight of the decision. They were at an impossible crossroads. If they continued to pull, everyone would be dragged into that endless darkness. "Let go of me, Lucas," Ben shouted, his voice panicked. "Go away!" Lucas hesitated for just a second, and then, with a lump in his throat, he let go of Ben's hand. Ben's scream echoed through the halls as he was pulled into the darkness, disappearing completely. Sophie fell to her knees, crying silently, while Lucas stood frozen, eyes glazed over, in the darkness that swallowed his friend. He knew there was no going back. No more. The creature laughed, Ben's voice now echoing through the tunnel. "You left me, Lucas, you left me." Lucas closed his eyes, holding Sophie's shoulders. "He saved us," he murmured. "Now we have to move on. For him." With one last look into the darkness, they turned and headed down the tunnel ahead, knowing they were closer to the end, or something much worse. Lucas and Sophie continued through the tunnel in silence, their eyes teary from Ben's sacrifice. Each step felt like an unbearable weight, and the guilt crushed Lucas like an invisible sledgehammer. He kept the flashlight in front of him, sweeping the damp walls, trying to ignore the distant whispers that still echoed with Ben's voice. "You left me, Lucas." "He didn't want us to die there," Sophie whispered, squeezing Lucas's arm. "We need to get out of here. We need to." It was then that they saw it, an old rusty iron door in front, almost hidden by a pile of bones. Unlike the previous passages, this one looked different, more modern, with deep, dry scratch marks as if someone had desperately tried to get out. Lucas ran to the door and tried to pull it, but it was locked with a heavy padlock. "There has to be a key," Sophie muttered, searching around frantically. As they searched, Lucas noticed something eerily familiar. Engraved on the wall next to the door were names, dozens of names crossed out, like a list of the condemned. And there, at the end of the list, were their names. Lucas, Sophie, Ben, Ethan. Only Ben's name was already crossed out. "That's not possible," Lucas whispered, feeling his blood run cold. Sophie found something on the floor, a rusty key covered in a dark substance. "Here." Lucas quickly fitted the key into the padlock, and with a metallic click, it opened. The gate creaked as it was pushed open, revealing a worn stone staircase leading upward towards a dim, flickering light. Hope blossomed in their hearts. That's a way out," Sophie gasped, holding on to Lucas's hand as they began to climb. With each step, the light became brighter, and they could feel a light breeze blowing, carrying the distant smell of the city. They were close, so close. But then, Lucas stopped abruptly. Something was wrong. The wind they felt was not fresh. It was hot and fetid, as if it were coming from the depths. Sophie looked at him, eyes wide. "Lucas, it's not a way out, is..." Before he could respond, the light ahead flashed violently, revealing what was at the top of the stairs. The same tunnel they had come from. They hadn't gone up. They had been deceived. Sophie began to hyperventilate. No, we went up. How?" It was then that a throaty laugh filled the air around them. Ben's voice echoed down the stairs. "You'll never get out. You'll never get out." The illusion dissipated in an instant, and Lucas realized that they had been led in circles by something that understood his mind better than he did. Despair took over them. They were trapped. There was no way out. But Lucas wasn't ready to give up. "It's not over yet," he murmured, holding Sophie's hand tightly and staring into the darkness. They would have to face the truth, or they would never see the light of day again. Sophie's desperation was evident. She was shaking her head frantically. "It can't be. I saw the light. I felt the wind." His voice was choked, and tears were streaming down his face. Lucas held her shoulders, trying to keep her focused. "Sophie, listen." They're manipulating us. They know what we're thinking. We need to keep a cool head. Sophie looked at the camera still recording and in an impulsive gesture began speaking directly into the lens. If anyone finds this, we'll try. My name is Sophie Parker. We're, trapped here in the catacombs. If you find this recording, please tell my family. Lucas approached the camera, his face covered in sweat and dust. My name is Lucas Carter. We came here looking for answers, but all we found was hell. Don't trust the tunnels. They change, they lie, and they... He hesitated, swallowing hard. They take you. He looked at Sophie, feeling fear exude from every pore of his body. We're going to get out of here. He lied more to himself than to her. From the bottom of the tunnel, the familiar whisper returned. You've been here too long, Lucas. Sophie choked on a sob, clutching the camera to her chest as if it were her last bit of reality. Lucas pulled her by the hand and walked forward, determined to continue. But as they advanced, the tunnels seemed to lengthen. The walls seemed to slowly change texture, pulsing as if they were alive. Then they turned a corner and stopped abruptly. There, in front of them, was a tripod with a camera just like Sophie's, positioned in exactly the same way. No, Sophie murmured, approaching hesitantly. When he checked the screen, his face paled. The video I was recording was already there. Everything they had said, done, and seen was recorded on that camera, as if someone already knew every step they would take before they even took it. Lucas felt an icy cold run down his spine. They're playing with us. Suddenly, the camera screen flickered, showing a still image. It was him, standing still, looking straight into the lens, but behind him was something huge, something that wasn't there in reality. He turned instinctively, but all he saw was darkness. Sophie fell to her knees, sobbing. We're stuck here forever, aren't we? Lucas closed his eyes, trying to block out the growing dread. Not yet. He pulled a piece of paper from his backpack and began scribbling one last message. If someone finds this, the catacombs aren't just a tomb. They're an organism. They live. They hunt. Before he could write more, the tunnel behind them shuddered, and the sound of scuffling filled the space. Time was running out. Lucas picked up the camera and looked directly at her, his eyes desperate. If anyone watches this, run, don't try to find us. He took the tape and stuck it between the cracks in a wall of bones. If we get out of here, we won't need her, he murmured. But deep down, he already knew the truth. They would never leave. Lucas and Sophie followed through the tunnel, their steps hurried and fear clouding their minds. The sound of something colossal dragging behind them grew louder by the second, and the feeling of being hunted was suffocating. Each turn felt all too familiar, as if they were walking in circles, falling deeper and deeper into the living trap that was the catacombs. Suddenly, Sophie stopped abruptly. Lucas, look! In front of them, a faint light flickered. It was different from the previous illusions. It was colder, more real. Without thinking, they ran towards him, tripping over the bones scattered on the ground. The light led them to a large hall, where an ancient corroded staircase led upward, ending in a thin iron railing. Fresh air penetrated through the cracks. It's the way out! Sophie screamed, tears of hope running down her face. Lucas didn't hesitate. He climbed the steps two at a time, pushing the railing with all his strength. It creaked, rusty and resistant, but gave way. They emerged into an old, abandoned building on the outskirts of Paris, where the pale light of dawn greeted them like a promise of life. They threw themselves on the ground, panting, dirty but alive. Sophie sobbed, laughing and crying at the same time. Lucas looked up at the gray sky, unable to believe they were there, but something was wrong. Sophie looked around, expression gradually changing from relief to terror. Lucas, where are we? The surroundings seemed too empty. There were no sounds of cars or people. The building seemed out of place in time, and the city around it was strange, like an imperfect replica of the Paris they knew. Lucas felt a shiver run down his spine. He stood up unsteadily and looked back, at the entrance they had come from. The catacombs were still there, and the darkness seemed to watch them, waiting patiently. "Lucas," Sophie whispered, tugging at his shirt. "Look at your arm." He looked down and saw something that made his stomach drop. Small marks, like surgical cuts, covered his skin. They were not recent. They were old, as if he had been there before. Suddenly, a familiar laugh echoed around them. "You guys never left." Lucas's eyes widened and he looked at Sophie, whose expression froze in pure horror. The surrounding streets began to distort, as if the city was melting, returning to the suffocating darkness of the tunnels. He understood, too late. The catacombs never let them out. They just changed, became something bigger. The screen on Sophie's camera, still on, flickered one last time before going dark, capturing the only truth of that night. No one ever comes out of the depths. Recordings only.